Were you ever spanked as a child? The practice seems to have fallen out of favor in recent years, but there are still plenty of people out there who are old enough that in their youth they were taken over a parent's knee and smacked when they were found to be disobedient. You may even have been told something like, "It's for your own good," or "This hurts me more than it hurts you." If not a spanking, perhaps you were put into timeout, or grounded, or denied TV or computer privileges for a certain amount of time. If that's the case, I want you to think back to those halcyon years of childhood and innocence and remember, how did you feel after being punished in that way? Did you agree with your parents that this was something that needed to happen? Did you recognize what a horrid, naughty little shit you were and resolve to mend your wicked ways? Something tells me probably not. When I was a child, back in the 90s and aughts, I was spanked. I never sensed any malice on my parents' part, and almost every time it seemed deliberate, ritualistic almost, as if they had decided this was best practice and was simply something that needed to be done. I don't think they took any pleasure in it, but the result was probably not what they had hoped for. When you talk to advocates for corporal punishment, they'll say it promotes discipline or that you can't reason with a child. But you see, I remember being a child. Even at a very young age, it was fully an option to reason with me. And when I was spanked, I didn't feel disciplined. I didn't feel a sudden urge to do better and become obedient. Being spanked made me fear my parents. It made me want to hide my mistakes from them, knowing that a possible reaction could be buttocks bruising. It didn't stop the mistakes from happening, it just damaged my relationship with my parents, making it harder to trust and communicate with them. Even less violent punishments like taking away movie privileges or toys or books didn't make me reflect upon my wrongdoing. It made me resentful and miserable. And I don't think I'm the only person for whom that's the case. So often you'll talk to boomers or older, usually conservative, who'll claim, "I was spanked and I came out fine." And then you'll hear them relate something else they think is totally normal, like how their parents yelled at each other or how a nerd at school was given multiple swirlies and the only thought you have is, "Wow, you really need some therapy." I was spanked, and I did not come out fine. The excellent channel of Jay Draper recently put out a video on public executions in England, specifically their purpose and whether or not you would have attended one. I encourage you to watch the entire video, link in the description, but the conclusion she came to was that while executions in the past had a very large religious implication of purging the criminal of their sin that they might find peace in heaven, their main function was to instill fear and obedience into the population. "Don't do these things or we'll hang you from the neck until dead. Now come and watch, and bring the kids too. It'll be very educational for the whole family." It was a display of power, not a moral judgment found to balance the severity of the crime. When we think of punishment now, we usually believe, or at least hope, that the point of it is to readjust the scales of good and evil, a penance for the trespass committed. We put people in jail to pay a debt to society, make them pay a fine if they drove too fast on the highway according to an ancient speed limit that hasn't been adjusted in decades, or if they were particularly naughty, kill them to prevent them from performing further acts of depravity. Except, traffic and parking tickets are almost entirely money-making schemes. Police officers literally have quotas they need to meet and tickets handed out because their cities don't make enough money from property taxes. Driving instructors love to point out that the likelihood of dying in a crash increases exponentially the faster you're driving, but they tend to fail to point out that the likelihood of a crash itself increases the more you differ from the average speed of the other cars around you. The safest speed to drive at is the one everyone else is driving at, which tends to be about 20 miles per hour faster than every single posted speed limit in the United States. And traffic police know this. I once got a speeding ticket not for going simply over the speed limit, but specifically for going more than 20 miles per hour over it. There's a joke my dad likes to make. You can go as fast as you want on the highway as long as someone else is going faster than you. Traffic tickets are not about safety, and they're not even about punishment. They're about filling the city's coffers. And what about jail? We like to think that people serve their time and come out humbled, penitent, and ready to rejoin society as better individuals. But that is patently not true. The U.S. Department of Justice keeps statistics on recidivism, the phenomenon of committing a crime again after being released from jail. From their analysis, over 80% of released prisoners go on to commit another crime within 10 years. Why is that? Might it have something to do with the fact that prisons are stressful environments where you're constantly constantly monitored with awful options for food and healthcare, and where sexual assault occurs so frequently that dropping the soap is treated as a fucking joke.
Doubloons! Don't drop them.
Meanwhile, if you manage to make it out of the slammer, you are now discriminated against when trying to find a job or housing, and in many states, you can't even vote anymore. And I haven't even touched on the prison industrial complex, where prisoners are leased out to companies to perform work at less than minimum wage. There are entire industries that are only able to function because of the cheap cost of prison labor. And when you look at the racial statistics of who's in prison with respect to the demographics of the country as a whole, you realize it's just slavery with extra steps. Now surely the death penalty, that must be our last bastion of justice, right? Wrong again! Firstly, taking a condemned prisoner through the appeals process of trying to stay their execution often costs the government more than just leaving them in prison for life. And why would that be? Because innocent people can and do get executed. According to the Innocence Project, since 1973, at least 200 people in the United States have been found innocent while on death row. And at least 4% of those executed were later determined to be innocent. And that number's probably a lowball, because who's gonna care about someone's innocence or guilt after they're dead?
Alright, Weiro, enough is enough. Stop wasting time and get to the point. This is supposed to be about a Disney movie, not criminal law.
But you see, you've activated my trap card. It's been relevant the whole time! The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad was originally called Two Fabulous Characters, before Disney finally realized that having a more descriptive title might be more memorable. There's a reason why a lot of people, including myself, keep mixing up which segments are in Make Mine Music and which are in Melody Time. I only know which is which because I just made a 20-minute video review for each of them, and I wouldn't count on myself remembering a year from now. This film, like Fun and Fancy Free, is two half-hour-ish segments paired together into one film, though with significantly less interstitial nonsense this time around, thankfully. Both The Wind in the Willows and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow had been in development for full-length features in their own rights. In fact, right after Pinocchio and Fantasia both flopped at the box office, the Bank of America, who had loaned Disney money, strolled on up to the studio like a goddamn mafia finger breaker and told Disney that they were not allowed to start any new projects, but had to finish the cartoons they already had in production, namely Bambi, Dumbo, and The Wind in the Willows. While Bambi and Dumbo came out pretty quickly after that, it took almost another decade for The Wind in the Willows to be complete, partly because the animators were having trouble making the story engaging for longer than an hour, and partly because Walt didn't really like it. His brother Roy had been the one to acquire the film rights, and having read the book, I can see why Walter Elias commie-hater Disney detested it. The novel, written by Kenneth Grahame, is essentially Be Gay, Do Crime's cottagecore for children. Rat and Mole are very heavily implied to be a queer couple. Badger at one point yells at Rat for being a linguistic prescriptivist, and Toad never harbors any guilt for his various crimes, escapes prison, and ends the book with a party and no lasting repercussions for having stolen multiple motor vehicles, including a goddamn train. I loved it. Why did no one tell me how fucking based this book is? The Wind in the Willows teaches us that friendship is more important than listening to the government, and every so often, you need to worship the muscular man-beast god that lives downriver and saves lost children while hauntingly playing the flute. In contrast, while the Mr. Toad segment of the film follows the events of the book pretty closely, skipping the gayer and more anarchist bits, the main adaptational difference is it is made painfully clear that Toad was framed. Book Toad knew exactly what he was doing and fully intentionally stole a car. Film Toad instead trades away his fucking mansion for a car, and the bartender who witnessed the sale then lies on the witness stand claiming Toad was trying to sell a stolen car. This may have been one of those Hays Code bullshit things where good guys can't be criminals, but it could also have been Walt himself not wanting his protagonist to be, as the book describes him, gay and irresponsible, which is my new status on Discord. What a banger of a line. Now, while that is on the one hand an undermining of Toad's character, it does in a roundabout way make the prison system seem more evil. Book Toad legitimately committed a crime, so yes, of course he goes to jail. He was naughty. His sentence is pretty ridiculous, with 15 of the 20 years being for giving a police officer cheek, which is depressingly just as true today as it was a century ago, but still, in some sense, deserved. Film Toad is innocent, however irresponsible he may be, and is sent to jail anyway. His time served and the subsequent escape sequence running from the cops who were constantly shooting guns at him is harrowing. Book Toad plans to give a speech on the sad state of his country's prison system. Film Toad's experience is a prime showcase of why prison is bad. Solitary confinement, what Toad is subjected to, is now widely considered to be torture. Having manacles kept on your ankles 24/7 is a great way to have your skin chafed, cut, and possibly even infected. Now, I know that plenty of you out there think shoving criminals in prison is totally justified because criminals did bad things. But firstly, innocent people can be framed and wrongly convicted and be subjected to those tortures. And secondly, even people who do bad things deserve to be treated humanely. A lot of people seem to think that criminals are an entirely different species, alien, monstrous creatures who should be kept away from normal, decent humans. A criminal, by definition, is simply someone who has committed a crime. What is considered a crime is dictated by the law, and laws are made by fallible human beings. Some laws are bad. Women not being able to vote or own property or even a credit card was the law. Segregation was the law. Slavery was the law. The entire American Revolution was, according to the laws of the British Empire, a crime.
Treason is a charge invented by winners as an excuse for hanging the losers.
Laws and crimes are social constructs, but punishments are very, very real, and we need to be very mindful of what we choose to inflict on our fellow human beings, or toads. This segment is very well done, easily some of the best of the entire package era. There's only one song, but it is quite catchy.
We're merrily, 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 merrily on our way to nowhere in particular.
And there's lots of subtle little things going on, like Mr. Winky polishing the witness stand like his bar, Toad changing into his street clothes under the confident yet wrong assumption he's about to be acquitted, and of course this exchange.
And what is the honest way?
I thought you wouldn't know that, Governor.
The fight with the weasels to get the deed back is fantastic, so well done in fact that its animation has been reused more than once in later Disney films. My one complaint is that Rat is made into a stiff stick in the mud, where in the book he's very convivial and fully on board with helping Toad get away with his crimes. The novel ends simply with the party celebrating victory over the weasels, while the film version gives Toad a new obsession in a very early airplane, which is just the perfect ending, and I'm not alone in thinking this, as other later adaptations like Terry Jones's film in the 90s keep this edition despite cleaving closer to the source material elsewhere. If I'm handing out a Lorcana card to anyone, it's gotta be Mr. Winky. I just love this sly, smug motherfucker with his permanent toothy grin. He's just so maliciously cheerful, letting you think you're getting the better of him while he's actively undermining you. Basically, he's Bugs Bunny if bugs were evil. It's fully possible I could have gone with a theme of obsession instead of crime and punishment, as Toad's is what drives the plot here, and there's a bit of obsession in the Sleepy Hollow segment as well, which we'll get to momentarily. Toad's first hyperfixation is his
Canary yellow gypsy got it.
Oy vey, I mentioned in the Pinocchio video that the Vardo has been co-opted by outgroups, and this is yet another example of that. Using that name for it wasn't seen as offensive either when the book was written or when the film was made, simply being a descriptor, but even by the 90s in Terry Jones's film, it's simply called
Caravan.
which avoids the slur, but is a much more generalized term that feels very bland. But as soon as Toad sees that motor car, he starts making engine noises and bouncing along down the road. I think a lot of us can recognize the feeling of being introduced to something new and realizing you will never find your way out of that rabbit hole. Like making YouTube videos about Disney movies! The Ichabod portion of the film is based on Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is a fair bit shorter than Graham's novel, and way too much of it is taken up by descriptions of various locales and people. The climactic chase with the Headless Horseman is barely a couple paragraphs long, almost an afterthought following many, many pages describing how shitty Ichabod's schoolhouse is, or how weird Ichabod's face and feet look, or how much shit the wealthy Baltus Van Tassel owns. Irving really needed some of my commenters leaning over his shoulder muttering,
Hurry up, get to the good shit.
The film version is narrated and has all its songs sung by Bing Crosby. I gave him shit a couple videos ago about the conservatism displayed in his star vehicle, White Christmas, but he genuinely has a very pleasing voice and he does a fantastic job as the storyteller here.
It's a quiet, peaceful place, and yet somehow foreboding.
The segment opens with Mr. Crane entering the town of Sleepy Hollow, welcomed with a musical number very reminiscent of Belle from Beauty and the Beast.
It's the new schoolmaster, what's his name?
Ichabod, Ichabod Crane.
Except Beauty and the Beast came out over 40 years later, so the reminiscing is actually the other way around. Regardless, the plot kicks into gear when Ichabod espies the lovely maid Katrina, very quickly becoming enamored of her
Father's money.
It's very clear that Ichabod is much more interested in the wealth he would inherit as Katrina's husband than any of her feminine charms. His chief rival in winning her and her father's affections is Brom Bones, our Gaston figure for the evening, except much more sympathetic. This whole middle section where Ichabod and Brom vie for Katrina's hand is very funny and culminates in a big party at the Van Tassel place. Brom tries his best to foist off one of the other village girls onto Ichabod to no effect. But despite essentially being a fat-phobic caricature, this lady is just so full of energy. I love her. She goes unnamed in the film, but the Disney Wiki tells me her name is Tilda. Give Tilda a Lorcana card, she deserves it. Brom, finally seeing the writing on the wall that Katrina and her father, pretty clearly like Ichabod more than him, pulls out one last trick from his sleeve and tells a ghost story.
When the spooks have a midnight jamboree, they break it up with fiendish glee. Ghosts are bad, but the one that's cursed is the headless horseman. He's the worst.
Because it turns out that Ichabod Crane, much like Mr. Toad, is an obsessive. For Ichabod, this manifests in a strict belief in and adherence to basically every single superstition known to man. And while the other guests are simply entertained by Brom's haunting tale, Ichabod believes every word of it. So when he heads home on his rickety plow horse, he sees ghosts in every crooked branch and swooping owl. And just when he has convinced himself it's all in his head... This whole scene is a masterwork of tension, and I can easily imagine the horsemen making small children shit themselves in terror. But the film heavily implies, and the book almost explicitly states, that the horseman was actually Brom Bones, making this not some dread specter waiting to snatch an unwary traveler, but an example of what is euphemistically called vigilante justice. With Mr. Toad, we discussed punishment under the law, so now let's discuss extra-legal punishments. When citizens take matters into their own hands, when the government refuses to act, or, to put it bluntly, lynching. That phrase comes from Charles Lynch, who during the Revolution imprisoned British loyalists without trial or even the proper jurisdiction. While Charles himself seems to have been impartial with regards to race, the term named after him is now historically most closely associated with kidnappings and hangings of black men by white mobs. In order to distance themselves from such heinous and despicable acts, those who believe the law is insufficient in punishing wrongdoers tend to prefer the term vigilante. Now, there are certainly times where legal authorities are lax in their duties, requiring community members to step up and fill the gaps, but there are reasons why part of the social contract involves a government. The most relevant reason here is oversight. Ostensibly, when someone is accused of a crime, they are brought to a court, where both sides of the case are argued by lawyers, a jury of the accused peers vote on whether the evidence presented is convincing enough to convict them, and then a judge that has been enforcing the rules of the courtroom this whole time decides what punishment, if any, is required. Lawyers and judges require years of education and certification and can be disbarred if they act inappropriately. Juries are drafted by random lottery, then carefully winnowed to avoid bias. And the laws which the accused is alleged to have broken are laid down by democratically elected representatives. In an ideal world, one without corruption or moneyed interests tipping the scales, every step of this process is held accountable to the people whom it is meant to be applied to. By contrast, vigilantism has no oversight. It is one or more private citizens taking matters into their own hands without consulting the wider community, without any legal authority. Such actions have no means of redressing wrongful decisions, no checks nor balances. It is a petty monarchy, with one person or a handful of people crowning themselves local kings and playing at judge, jury, and executioner, with no respect to the rights or dignity of the person they think did them wrong. How does Batman know the guy he's beating into a pulp actually committed a crime? Slapping a masked mook with a batarang and then hanging him up in front of the Gotham PD doesn't exactly meet the definition of habeas corpus. All of this to say, we shouldn't feel too good about Brom Bones smugly marrying Katrina after secretly dispatching his chief rival for her affections. What crime exactly did Ichabod commit? Sure, he was new in town, but all he did was enjoy the hospitality of the other residents of Sleepy Hollow and try to woo an attractive and wealthy young woman. Getting friend-zoned is not something you can bring someone to court for. If Brom Bones had only told a ghost story and freaked out Ichabod so much that he left, he'd just be a mean-spirited prankster. But if you bean someone in the kisser with a flaming pumpkin and then hide the body, that's murder, even if you are dressed up like a ghost. Overall, this segment, like its partner, is very well done. Its colonial American Halloween aesthetic can clearly be seen in later stories, particularly Over the Garden Wall. I'm not sure I'd say there's a particularly good reason to pair these two specific stories together, but The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is nonetheless a refreshing return to form for Disney, harbinging the classics to come in the restoration of the 50s. So if punishment isn't just, what should we do instead? Surely we can't just let murderers and rapists run around unfettered. Well, prison abolition movements advocate for exactly that. Only particularly radical groups believe that prisons should be removed without any replacement, as generally the idea is to have new systems to reform and re-educate offenders. Instead of holding people up in slightly worse college dormitories, the idea is to give them access to books and classes. If we want criminals to leave prison ready to reintegrate back into society, we can't just leave them in a box for however many years. We have to actually put in the effort to help them get better. That requires teachers, therapists, social workers, career counselors, and security guards who actually prioritize the safety of their inmates. We also use prison way too much. Drug crimes in particular are overpunished, largely as a consequence of the disastrous failure that was the war on drugs. What drug users need is addiction treatment and needle exchanges, not prison. There should be more of a focus on reparative justice. If someone is convicted of a crime, they should work to fix the mess they made. This is where community service comes in. If someone cuts down an endangered tree, instead of prison or a fine, have them work with the local park service for a year. If someone illegally sold firearms, they could work with the buyback program trying to get weapons off the streets. There are so many more productive things that convicted criminals could be doing than sitting in prison or working in a sweatshop for a horrid corporation. So what worked for me? My parents didn't spank for no reason at all. I got in my fair share of trouble as a child. Honestly, I was kind of a terror. But I'm not in prison now. I'm not in a gang or shooting up heroin under a bridge somewhere. What changed? For me specifically, and this is going to sound nutty at first, it was martial arts. Before I started doing Kung Fu, I thought the idea of obedience for its own sake was silly, and I still do. If you think obedience is a virtue, please go read Ella Enchanted and save your children their inevitable therapy sessions about you. But when you're sparring with someone and a kick to the face is not only a possibility, but encouraged, you learn very quickly to pay attention to what's going on around you. Little League didn't work for me because I was shit at baseball, so they put me in the outfield where nothing ever happened, leaving me bored, so when a chance fly ball did come out to me, I wasn't paying attention. By contrast, martial arts is immediate and right in front of you. You have to pay attention to not just what's around you, but to what your whole body is doing. When I started doing Kung Fu, it was as if I had opened my eyes fully for the first time in my life. Instead of just living in my own daydream land, focused inward, I was actually paying attention to what was around me. I was looking at other people and actually seeing them as people. Martial arts taught me empathy as well as discipline and self-confidence. The National Institute of Health conducted a recent study finding that children participating in martial arts was good for their physical health, but I think research should be done on its effects on mental health as well. This was also around the same time my parents basically stopped spanking me. It seems they had finally figured out that punishment wasn't really working, so maybe they should try teaching me instead. I'd like to give a big shout out to my Patreon patrons. This content is funded by viewers like you. Donations help me acquire research materials and get videos out sooner. It's only $5 a month, or $10 if you'd like your name shown at the end of my videos. It'd go right here. Either way, please join me next time as we leave the package era and take a look at Cinderella.